Hi friends, welcome to Talevora. Today, we uncover the extraordinary story of Queen Elizabeth II, the little girl who was never expected to become queen until one unexpected turn changed the entire course of her life. She grew up quietly, watched her family face enormous pressure, and dreamed of a life far removed from the throne. But then, at just 25 years old, a devastating family loss suddenly placed the crown on her head. What happened to the young woman who had to leave her private life behind and become one of the most recognized people on earth? This is not just the story of a queen. It is the unforgettable journey of duty, sacrifice, family, love, loss, and a lifetime spent serving millions of people. Let's begin. Before the crown, before the palaces, before millions of people watched her every move, Elizabeth was simply a young girl growing up inside a royal family. She was born on April 21, 1926, in London, the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York, who would later become King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. At the time of her birth, nobody expected that this little girl would one day become Britain's longest reigning monarch. Her uncle, Edward VIII, was ahead of her in the line of succession, and her father was not yet king. Elizabeth's early life was therefore surprisingly different from the life she would eventually live. She and her younger sister Margaret spent much of their childhood away from the intense public spotlight. They were raised with a strong sense of duty, but they also experienced ordinary childhood moments inside royal residences. Elizabeth developed a love for horses, dogs, and outdoor life, and those interests remained with her throughout her life. But everything changed when she was still a child. In 1936, her grandfather, King George V, died. His eldest son became King Edward VIII. For a young Elizabeth, it was a family change that suddenly placed her closer to the throne. But nobody could have predicted what would happen before the year was over. Edward VIII fell in love with Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been divorced and whose personal situation created a constitutional crisis. The king wanted to marry her, but the political and religious circumstances made the marriage unacceptable to the government of the time. Eventually, Edward made the decision to abdicate the throne, and suddenly, Elizabeth's father became King George VI. The little girl who had never expected to become queen was now the heir presumptive. She was only 10 years old. Imagine being 10 years old and discovering that your future has suddenly been rewritten. There would be no ordinary adulthood waiting for her. No completely private life. No freedom to simply choose whatever career she wanted. Her future had been decided by events far beyond her control. Yet Elizabeth continued growing up with an unusual sense of responsibility. Her education was carefully arranged, and she learned about constitutional matters, history, languages, and public duties. But her childhood was also shaped by something much larger than the royal family. Europe was moving toward war. In 1939, Britain entered the Second World War. Elizabeth was 13. The war changed everyday life across Britain, and even the royal family could not remain untouched by it. The king and queen stayed in Britain during the bombing of London and became symbols of national endurance. Elizabeth watched her parents carry the emotional weight of a country at war, and she was learning something that would define her own future. Public duty sometimes meant continuing forward even when life was frightening. As the war continued, Elizabeth gradually began taking on responsibilities of her own. In 1940, while still a teenager, she made a radio broadcast to children across the Commonwealth. She spoke directly to young people who had been separated from their families because of the war. It was one of her earliest major public appearances, and it gave the world a glimpse of the young woman she was becoming. But Elizabeth did not simply sit inside a palace while the country fought. When she turned 18, She wanted to contribute more directly to the war effort. She joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army, where she trained as a driver and mechanic. It was a remarkable experience for a future queen. She learned practical skills, worked alongside other women, and became the first female member of the British royal family to serve as a full-time active member of the armed forces. The young princess was becoming more independent, and during those years, another important relationship was developing in her life. His name was Philip. Elizabeth had first met Philip when she was much younger, but their relationship gradually became more serious. They exchanged letters, and after the war, their engagement was announced. On November 20, 1947, Princess Elizabeth married Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten at Westminster Abbey. She was 21. The wedding was celebrated across a country still recovering from war. Britain was facing shortages and economic difficulties, yet millions of people watched the young couple begin their life together. For Elizabeth, it was a moment of happiness. She was a wife, and soon she would become a mother. In 1948, her first child, Charles, was born. 2 years later, Princess Anne followed. For a brief period, Elizabeth experienced something close to the family life she might once have imagined. But behind the happiness, her father's health was deteriorating. King George VI had suffered serious health problems, and Elizabeth gradually began taking on more official responsibilities. She represented him at events and prepared herself for a future she knew might come sooner than expected. Then, in early 1952, Elizabeth and Philip left Britain for a Commonwealth tour. Her father was too ill to travel, so she went in his place. They stopped in Kenya before continuing the journey. And then, on February 6, everything changed. Elizabeth was in Kenya when she received the news that her father had died. She was only 25 years old. In a single moment, she went from Princess Elizabeth to Queen Elizabeth II. The private daughter who had just lost her father now had to return home as the monarch of the United Kingdom. Her grief and her new responsibility arrived together. There was no time to simply step back and process what had happened. The crown was waiting, and the young woman who had never expected to wear it was about to begin the longest. Returning to Britain as queen was not simply a change of title. Elizabeth had lost her father, and at the same time she had inherited an enormous responsibility. The woman who had spent her early 20s building a family life was suddenly expected to represent an entire nation and a changing commonwealth. She was young, but the world watching her did not care about her age. They wanted certainty. They wanted stability. They wanted a queen who could carry the weight of the institution she now represented. Elizabeth understood that her life had changed permanently. She began settling into her role, working with government leaders, traveling, meeting foreign heads of state, and learning how to balance tradition with a rapidly changing world. But there was still one important moment ahead: her coronation. More than a year after her accession, Elizabeth was crowned at Westminster Abbey on June 2, 1953. The ceremony became one of the defining moments of the 20th century. For the first time, a British coronation was televised, allowing millions of people to watch the ceremony from their homes. Elizabeth was no longer simply the young princess who had unexpectedly inherited the throne. She was now Queen Elizabeth II in the eyes of the entire world. Yet the world around her was changing rapidly. The British Empire was transforming, and the Commonwealth was developing a new identity. Countries that had once been part of Britain's imperial system were becoming independent nations. Elizabeth's role was therefore not simply to preserve an old world. She had to navigate a new one. She traveled extensively, meeting people across different countries and cultures. Her public life became a constant cycle of ceremonies, visits, speeches, meetings, and responsibilities. Behind the scenes, however, she was also building a family. More children arrived. Prince Andrew was born in 1960, followed by Prince Edward in 1964. Elizabeth and Philip now had 4 children. But being a mother while being monarch meant that private and public life could never be completely separated. Every family decision could become a public story. Every disagreement could become a newspaper headline. Every mistake could become a national conversation. The media environment was also changing. Television brought the royal family directly into people's homes. The public could now see more of their lives than ever before. This created new opportunities, but it also created new pressures. Elizabeth's image had to evolve. She had to remain traditional enough to represent the monarchy while also appearing connected to a modern society. Over the decades, she faced political crises, social changes, family difficulties, and a public increasingly willing to question institutions that previous generations had accepted without much debate. One of the most difficult challenges came in the 1980s and 1990s, when the marriages and personal lives of members of the royal family became major subjects of international media attention. Her son Charles married Diana Spencer in 1981. Their wedding was watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Diana quickly became one of the most famous women on earth. She was young, charismatic, compassionate, and extremely popular with the public. But behind the fairy tale image, the marriage became increasingly troubled. Charles and Diana eventually separated, and their relationship became the subject of relentless media coverage. Elizabeth was now facing a problem that was becoming harder to control. The monarchy's private family struggles were being played out in public. Newspapers, television networks, and photographers followed every development. The royal family could no longer control the story as easily as it once had. And then came 1997. Diana's death in Paris shocked the world. Millions of people mourned her, and the public reaction was enormous. For the royal family, it became one of the most difficult moments of Elizabeth's reign. The monarchy faced intense criticism over its response to the tragedy, while enormous crowds gathered outside royal residences. Elizabeth had spent decades maintaining a careful distance between her private emotions and her public role. But suddenly the public wanted something different. They wanted to see grief. They wanted to feel that the royal family was grieving alongside them. It was a painful lesson in how much the relationship between the monarchy and the public had changed. Elizabeth eventually addressed the nation in a televised broadcast, speaking about Diana and the grief surrounding her death. The crisis did not destroy the monarchy, but it became a major turning point. The institution had to adapt to a public culture that demanded more openness and emotional connection. Elizabeth continued. She did not abandon the role. She returned to her duties, continued traveling, meeting people, opening buildings, attending ceremonies, and representing Britain. Her ability to continue working became one of the defining characteristics of her public life. Years passed. The world changed again. The internet transformed communication. Social media changed celebrity culture. Smartphones changed how people consumed news. Governments changed. Prime ministers changed. Entire generations grew up knowing only one British monarch. Elizabeth remained. She became a constant presence through decades of extraordinary change. In 2015, she became Britain's longest-reigning monarch, surpassing the record previously held by Queen Victoria. But perhaps the most remarkable part was not simply the length of her reign. It was how many different eras she had lived through. She had been a child during the final years of the 1920s. She had lived through the Second World War. She had become queen during the early years of television. She had witnessed the arrival of computers computers, the internet, mobile phones, and social media. And through all of it, she continued performing the same basic duty she had accepted when she was 25, service. But as she grew older, the world began to realize that even the woman who seemed almost permanent could not remain forever. By the time Queen Elizabeth II entered the final years of her life, she had become more than a monarch. For millions of people, she was a familiar presence that had existed throughout their entire lives. Grandparents had watched her coronation. Their children had watched her grow older. Their grandchildren had grown up seeing her on television and online. But behind the public image was an elderly woman whose life was gradually becoming quieter. In 2021, Elizabeth experienced one of the most personal losses of her later years when Prince Philip died after more than 7 decades of marriage. Their relationship had lasted longer than most people's entire lifetimes. The funeral was deliberately small because of the restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic. Images of Elizabeth sitting alone at the service became one of the most powerful photographs of the final period of her life. It showed something that royal ceremonies usually hide: loneliness. The woman who had spent decades surrounded by crowds was sitting alone, grieving her husband. Yet even after that loss, she continued working. She carried on with official duties, meeting leaders, and carrying out constitutional responsibilities. In 2022, the country celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, marking 70 years since she became queen. It was an extraordinary milestone. Few people could imagine anyone else reaching it. Across Britain and the Commonwealth, celebrations were held in her honor. But the celebrations also carried an unspoken reality. Elizabeth was 96 years old. Her reign was approaching its final chapter. In September 2022, she traveled to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where she carried out one of her final constitutional duties. She formally appointed Liz Truss as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Photographs from that meeting showed an elderly queen still performing her role despite her age. Just 2 days later, the world learned that Queen Elizabeth II had died peacefully at Balmoral on September 8, 2022. She was 96 years old. Her death brought an immediate end to a reign that had lasted 70 years. Across Britain and around the world, people reacted with shock and grief. For many, it felt strangely personal. They had never met her, yet she had been present throughout their entire lives. People had watched her appear at weddings, funerals, jubilees, state visits, Christmas broadcasts, and countless public ceremonies. Now, suddenly, she was gone. The woman who had become queen at 25 had reached the end of her journey at 96. Her son Charles became King Charles III, and the world entered a new royal era. But Elizabeth's story was never really about a crown. It was about the unexpected path her life took. She had not been born expecting to become queen. At 10 years old, her future changed because of her uncle's abdication. At 25, it changed again when her father died. From that point forward, she carried a responsibility that would last for 7 decades. She experienced enormous happiness, including marriage, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She also experienced devastating losses, family difficulties, public criticism, and moments when the institution she represented was questioned. She lived through a world that changed almost beyond recognition. When she was born, there was no internet. There were no smartphones. Television had not yet become a part of everyday life. By the end of her reign, billions of people could watch events instantly on screens around the world. Yet Elizabeth remained one of the most recognizable people in that changing world. Her story is therefore therefore not simply the story of a queen who sat on a throne for 70 years. It is the story of a woman whose entire life was reshaped by circumstances she never chose. And perhaps that is what makes her journey so compelling. The little girl who once lived a relatively protected childhood never asked to become the center of an institution. The young woman who married Prince Philip never knew that she would spend most of her adult life as one of the world's most watched people. The mother who raised 4 children could never completely separate family life from public duty. And the elderly woman who lost her husband continued working because she believed the responsibility she had accepted decades earlier still mattered. Whether people admired the monarchy, questioned it, or simply watched it from a distance, Elizabeth's life became part of modern history. But for Talevora, the most important part of her story is something more human. Sometimes life does not give us the future we imagined. Sometimes it gives us responsibilities we never asked for. And when that happens, we have a choice. We can spend our lives asking why it happened to us, or we can decide what we will do with the life we have been given. Elizabeth's life was shaped by unexpected events from childhood, but she built her identity around one simple idea: duty. She spent 70 years serving in a role she inherited rather than chose. And whether you see her as a symbol of tradition, a figure of history, or simply an extraordinary woman who lived through an extraordinary century, one thing is undeniable: her life was unlike almost anyone else's. The girl who was never expected to become queen became Queen Elizabeth II. And when her story finally ended in September 2022, an era ended with her. Behind the crown was a daughter who lost her father, a wife who lost her husband, a mother who watched her children grow, and a woman who spent an entire lifetime carrying a responsibility that began unexpectedly and never truly left her. This was the remarkable life of Queen Elizabeth II. If you enjoyed this true story, subscribe to Talevora for more unforgettable real-life stories of the world's most famous personalities. Because behind every famous name, there is a story. And sometimes, the most extraordinary stories are the ones that begin with a life nobody expected to change.